We got to take our deepest passion and connect it to the world's deepest pain. And when our passions, the things that we love and are skilled in, connect with the world's pain and suffering, then that's where the magic happens. Then we do things that we're really wired to do, and it gives life to other people.
All right, everybody. Hey, welcome to another 10,000 Minutes podcast.
Woo! I'm crashing this intro. Hello, everybody. It's Moy.
Totally. Hey, Moy. Everybody. Todos los gentes. That means all the people.
Thank you for the translation. I was lost for a second.
Yeah, no, it's okay, Moy. I'm just come to me with any of that stuff.
So kind.
Okay, you guys, today we just finished a podcast with Shane Claiborne. And if you don't know who that guy is, that's great. But if you do, that's great. And just saying that name might make some people go, okay, what's going to happen here? Because the guy's kind of radical. It's like John the Baptist. It's like bringing John the Baptist on a podcast. Because the stuff he's going to say, you're going to go, oh my gosh, dang it. That's really Jesus-like, but he's kind of pushing on things that I don't want him to push on. Wouldn't you say?
Yes. Maybe some comfort zones.
Yeah, just some, but here's the thing I hope we can do. You guys, you may or may not agree or disagree with all the things that are said on here. And that is so okay. The point with us is not that you'd agree with all the things that we say or that we agree with or our theology or ideologies. We don't have to all agree on all these things. But hopefully this is just one of those things that gets us thinking and pushes us forward a little bit on our rethinking what it means to actually practice the way of Jesus all week long. If we can just take it and not go straight political with things, but just take it and put it in a glass box. Some of these things that he's going to talk about, whether it's the death penalty or the war or guns or homeless or immigrants and that whole community, whatever these are, we hear these things and we just go straight political with them. And if we can just put each of these in this glass box and just be aware of it and look at it right in front of us and not go straight there, just suspend judgment for a little bit. If you would you just suspend judgment and not go, well, here's my things. I think guns are great because XYZ. Great. That's awesome. You can have your own thoughts. That's wonderful. I've got my own thoughts. But if we can just stop and just pause and suspend judgment and say, Jesus, what do you look like? How do I see you more beautifully in this? How will that actually translate to the rest of the people around me? So our series, Moy, is on relationships.
Yep.
And so this one specifically is on this idea of subversive friendships. And it gets into so much more than that. But it's how do we see people around us and what's our role in making the world more beautiful? What's our relationship to the world making it more beautiful?
Yeah.
So Shane Claiborne, the first book that I remember my buddies and I read years ago was The Irresistible Revolution. And in the podcast, you guys, I can't even say it. It was like I somehow got tongue twisted on it. It's so dumb. I'm like, it's your first book. It's the irreluctant.
I was like, fake fan.
Total fake fan. It was so dumb.
No, I'm just kidding, guys.
No, but that's why I felt like I'm looking at him. I'm going, I can't even say the name of your first book, but it really impacted me a lot.
Yeah,
that
it's like my favorite book.
So stupid. Shane worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta. I formed the Simple Way in Philadelphia, which you'll hear about. He heads up the Red Letter Christians group. He's an advocate all over the place. He's got a ton of books. Jesus for President, Red Letter Revolution. Anyways, there's so many books here, and they're just awesome. He's won a ton of awards. He's been on Fox News. He's been on Al Jazeera, CNN, NPR. He's just a true revolutionary, and I'm just intrigued and have been for years. So I wanted to interview him, and so we got to.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's different. I want to encourage you to listen to it not as a debate, but as a conversation between people that have agreed this is a safe space and that we will continue to be the church together after this conversation. And so we encourage you to listen to it as if you also have a seat at the table. I want you to listen with an open mind and feel free to write down all of your thoughts and send us all your feedback because that's the beauty of being in a community together. So really excited for you guys to listen.
Let's go.
Let's do this.
Welcome to the 10,000 Minute Podcast.
Woo!
Thank you very much.
That's a strong intro. We nailed that.
Top 3.
Okay, where are you right now?
I am in the city of love, Philadelphia, where I've lived this has been my home for 25 years, and our little community that we started 25 years ago, before you even knew what pickleball was, Tim.
Touche. People ask me, hey, what's the biggest surprise city that you've been to? And that is, I think, my favorite. That's like been the biggest surprise of like, this is a freaking cool town. The people were killer. The food was great. I really, really was surprised with how cool that town was. So
driving is not great. Kind of our own driving rules. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Really? What's that mean?
Well, you got the Philly left, which means like most places you do not turn left in front of the opposing traffic, but Philly you do. You got it. Quick left, the little right in front of the other people.
Yeah, if there's
light,
like two lights, people are you're going like, oh gosh, this is no. If you're listening, people, I'm using my hands. This is so stupid, but it's like you just turn in front of people. It's just how you do. Philly left. It's the Philly left.
The Philly left. We also don't do the pedestrian right away. I mean, you just don't. We don't have that here.
Yeah.
It's tragic.
Like,
I'm not. This
sorry,
is not the
sucks to
proud.
be
These
you,
are
that
not
type
our
of thing?
proudest moments as a city, but
Okay.
I'm just saying. Like, if you come to Philly, don't expect the pedestrian right away.
Yeah. Wait. I mean, if it's not the Philly left, it's the Philly. You know what I mean? I'm trying to find some good quick words when I go to Philadelphia and I'm like, yeah, what's up, you guys? I'll take a Philly left. That I feel like I'm kind of new school. So if you think about it at some point, just text me. That's
Okay.
Shane, there are 10,080 minutes in a week. 80 of those minutes, a lot of people spend in a church gathering at some point, which is awesome. It's great. But there are 10,000 other minutes, and not like what do we do for God in those 10,000 minutes, but how do we join him in the midst of the 10,000 minutes? We don't have to work for him anymore. We just get to join him. Like that's the point of this. And I know that theologically and ideology, with my ideology, all those things are just beautiful. But to live that out is a whole different ballgame. I mean, that's probably my issue, and that's probably most of our issues. And so this whole podcast is, what does it look like for us to join Jesus and practice the ways of Jesus during the week? And man, I remember reading Irresistible Revolution. Wow, that was a mouthful. But I remember that my buddies and all read that years ago when it first came out, and it was like, uh-oh, what's this guy doing? He's kind of calling me out and my buddies out onto the floor a little bit, kind of saying, hey, and not that your intention was to like call us out on the floor, but you were just asking these great questions that were pushing people toward, okay, Jesus is saying some pretty radical things that we might have lost the lead on most of what it looks like to actually follow the way of Jesus. So anywho, I love having you on here. You haven't said jack crap yet, but I've been talking. I've said a lot of really great things so far.
I will say this. There is a old quote that says, it's not the part of the Bible that I don't understand that disturbs me. It's the parts of the Bible that I do understand that disturb me. So that's kind of what happened for me. I started reading the Sermon on the Mount and sell everything you have and give it to the poor and love your enemies and the last are first and, all that stuff. So it messed me up, man. Yeah. Flip my world around.
So will you just give us a little background on what shaped you into what you're doing now, but just into how you're seeing the world today?
Yeah. Well, so I grew up in the deep South Bible Belt of Tennessee. My ancestors are on the same hills as Dolly Parton in the Smoky Mountains. And my uncle just told me, there's a moonshiner show now. Apparently there's a moonshiner show. And I was like, I didn't know that. And he said, yeah, those are our cousins. So moonshine people, hill people. But I fell in love with Jesus down in Tennessee. And I also began to see some of the funk and the contradictions and things that, for instance, we said we are pro-life, but we really only framed that in terms of abortion. And on almost every other issue of life and death, We weren't always the best champions. In fact, we often have been the obstacles to championing life and the death penalty, guns, militarism, all that. So there's been a lot of moments where I've had a real powerful second conversion or third conversion on it. I mean, my dad was in the military. I grew up with guns. So all of that was very familiar to me. And it gives me a lot of grace when I'm talking with other people that want to bust out Romans 13 to justify the death penalty. And I'm like, I know that. I've done, I'm familiar with that argument. I've used it, but I kept coming back to Jesus. And ironically, the deeper I fell in love with Jesus, the more I found myself at odds with some of the things that have come to characterize American, evangelical Christianity. But, the last 25 years in Philly, we've been forming this community. And there's that old saying that says, where you sit determines what you see. Like gun violence became a passion of mine because we saw too many people killed and couldn't not do something about it, Same with racism. I grew up really trusting the justice system and things like that. But the more I've lived in a different space and had different experiences with police and things like that, it's kind of changed how I think of a lot of things.
Okay, so let's get into what you're doing now. I'd love to back into that a little bit on the stories that got you to this place. So you kind of just went over them quickly, but what are some of the stories that got you to this place of advocating for others? And what are you doing right now? So you talked about this community for 25 years, so go.
Well, it started when I was an undergrad at Eastern University. It's about 25 minutes outside of Philly. And there was a group of poor and homeless families. These are mostly mothers and children that were on the waiting list for affordable housing in Philly. So we're talking like a 10-year waiting list for affordable housing, 3,000 families on that waiting list. And so they looked around North Philly and they saw that we've got 30,000 abandoned buildings, more abandoned buildings than there are folks on the street. And it doesn't make any sense, and so they found this old abandoned Catholic church and they moved into it. And it had been abandoned for years, had an entire convent and rectory and school with 40 classrooms, and they made that home. And sadly, the Catholic Church told them that they were trespassing, and if they weren't out within 2 days, they could be arrested. And that's what sort of started everything for us. The families hung a banner on the front of that cathedral that said, "How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday?" And they held a press conference. And at the press conference, they said, "We mean no disrespect to the Catholic officials and the archdiocese, but we've talked to the real owner of this building. And God said that we can stay." So, that's really how things started for us.
Wow.
Okay. So then all of a sudden it just happened, or what was your role in that?
Well, that lasted for months and months. And we ended up, my college friends and I, reading the book of Acts, where it talks about the early church and how everyone shared everything they had. And they actually literally put the offerings at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to folks as they had need. I mean, and then it literally says there were no needy persons among them because they shared everything they had. That vision caught us, of love and community, of sharing possessions, and of church lived out of dinner tables and living rooms and out on the sidewalk, not confined to buildings, as you said. I've always said church is not a meeting you go to or a building that you go into. The church is something we are. We're the body of Christ. It's a living being, the embodiment of God's love in the world. And so that's what we've been after for 25 years. And there's a lot of, stories along the way that have shaped that. We didn't have any idea what we were doing. So we wrote Mother Teresa a letter when she was still alive and went over there and worked with her in India. And that was massively formative for me and for our community, even our name, The Simple Way. Mother Teresa used to say that following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Loving our neighbor is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. So the simple way, we've been defined by Mother Teresa's idea that we're not to do great things, but small things with great love. So that's what we've always been after. And the kind of idea, not of mega church, but of micro church, right? Of trying to live that out in a particular place with a neighborhood. And then everything else kind of stirs out of that. Like now we're melting guns down and turning them into garden tools. But that came just from seeing too many people killed in our neighborhood and catching this vision in Scripture that will beat our swords into plows and spears into pruning hooks. Work on the death penalty came partly from trying to grapple with the ramifications of grace, and do we believe anybody's beyond redemption? And even now with the escalating violence in Gaza, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." What's that look like right now? So those are all questions that we're asking in a kind of hyper-local way, but also when it comes to the global family and what it means to try to be God's people in this moment in history.
So, okay, so one of the things I want to talk to you about today and just learn with you and from you is this idea of subversive friendships. You're in a building, you have a building, what is it called? The Simple Way?
Yeah.
It's a place where a bunch of people live. Just give a little background on that before I jump into subversive friendships.
Yeah, it's turned into kind of a village. I actually used to live in this room that we're in. It's our office now. We have like a bunch of houses around this that we do life together and have community gardens and paint murals. And we've got our shop around the corner where we chop the guns up. It's turned into sort of a little village. And on our front door, it says, "God, heal all that is broken in our hearts, in our streets, and in our world." And I think that kind of captures our continual prayer, that God is personal and healing individuals. God's also healing our city and our streets, our neighborhood, and God's healing our world. And sometimes in parts of Christianity, focus on one of those at the expense of another, that this is just about personal salvation and saving souls, getting them into heaven. Right. And we lose a whole part of the kind of social transformation and the systemic injustices and the stain that sin and racism has left on our society. So I think God's kind of restoring everything.
Love that. Okay, subversive friendships. What did you mean? I've heard you say that once, and I was like, that's a crazy great line. I can't wait to ask him about that. Here I am, asking you about subversive friendships.
We are all most comfortable around people who are like us, people who think like us, eat like us, talk like us, vote like us. And we're most uncomfortable around people that are different from us. And I would say at the very heart of the gospel is this invitation to trespass over the social constructs and boundaries of homogenous sameness, And I mean, even just looking at Jesus's dinner table.
Uniformity.
Yeah.
Right.
Jesus is dining with and hanging out with and building community with a zealot revolutionary and a Roman tax collector. And, zealots killed tax collectors for fun on weekends.
Yeah.
So you got marginalized women that were really stigmatized and shunned, and the teachers of the law, and folks that were at the center of power. And he's challenging everything, right? He's challenging the tax collecting system. He's challenging the idea of a violent revolution, and he's shaping this new community that's actually centered around love. And so I think of that today. What does that kind of look like for us? And for me, this little movement that we've been a part of, that's kind of the more public and movement side of things, called Red Letter Christians. We get our name from the Bibles that highlight the words of Jesus in red. And we often say that we're a web of subversive friends, because we are trying to love God and love our neighbor, but that doesn't mean we're all going to do it the same way. And in fact, I've found that you can create tremendous momentum when you have friendships with people who have different spheres of influence or different social networks than our own. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that. But for instance, on gun violence, it's not just a bunch of liberals that are going to move the barometer on it. I've seen tons of momentum from hunters against assault weapons and gun owners concerned about gun violence. There's whole coalitions of folks. And my family members, some of them would be in that category of gun owners that are deeply concerned about the 40,000 lives lost every year to guns in America, and think like we've got to do better to save lives. And on the death penalty, all kinds of friends that have been impacted by the death penalty. They're credible voices, right? So it's not just someone with a theological degree, but a friend of mine who's still politically very conservative, but he is a former executioner. He carried out the executions and it haunted him. And he ended up saying, there's just no good way to kill people. Like when at the end of the day, this is a system that is destroying lives. And it's also a faith crisis when you're literally denying the power of Jesus to transform a human being who's committed murder and saying like, isn't God's power bigger than that? You know? And so that's why I think a lot of these are about bringing together people that might seem to be unlikely friends, you know, and we've certainly been doing that around the conflict in Gaza in the escalating violence and genocide there. So many Palestinian Christians and others alongside Jewish folks and people of all faiths and no faith in particular that want to see an end to the violence and that are convinced that love is not a limited resource, right? You can call out the evil of October 7th done by Hamas and grieve the 1,200 lives that were lost on October 7th and say what's happened since October 7th is also indefensible and it's heart-wrenching, and we should be outraged by the killing of Gaza's children and the now, you know, over 13,000, 14,000 children and 30,000 people that have been killed. Like my mama said, 2 wrongs don't make a right, you know? But I don't believe that the political categories, liberal and conservative, left and right, that those are incredibly helpful. I think a lot of us don't find ourselves fitting really comfortably in those, or we're just ticked. You're just like, man, no one seems to be getting much done. So like some of this stuff is not about left and right, but about right and wrong. And things like welcoming immigrants. I mean, that shouldn't be a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. That should be a Christian thing for anyone and others, but certainly for anyone that claims to follow Jesus. Jesus said, when you welcome the stranger, you'll welcome me. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't get much clearer than that.
So one of my questions is, because I've been following you for years and I just appreciate your questions and the stuff that you're bringing up. And you're kind of like, I don't care. We're checking this stuff out there, whether you agree or not. With most of these things, you could just put Jesus in all these places and you go, I think Jesus is going to be the guy who's going down and doing a lot of things that you're actually involved with, or he's the one pushing for peace. He's the one pushing to welcome a whole community of people that are just literally homeless, whether that's they're coming in from other countries or they're homeless here. But why is there such a division? I mean, is it just a political thing? Like the pushback that you're getting, I'm sure you get a lot of pushback from Jesus people. What is it? Have we just gotten crazy with our political views so much that we can't even see? Because when you say it's the way of Jesus, I've got friends and family that would go, nope, that's actually the way of Jesus is condemning that person. Or, you know, I mean, sadly, that would be actually something that might be said by some of my friends. But it's like, no, Jesus would say, what was this right? Was this right and wrong? You need to change your ways and then do this, which I very much disagree with. But what is the actual problem that the Christians are saying and coming to you with? You seem to be in the middle of a lot of really difficult conversations, and you're pushing for immigration. You're pushing at the homeless community. You're pushing for gun rights, all these things that are like major red flags to most Christians. And in this culture, that would be the kind of Republican right-wing side of things would really not like you. Why is that? Because I think the things you're talking about, you're like, guys, this is hard to argue with. This is the way that Jesus did it. He was the guy who was for all these people. So what is the disconnect there? Why can't we hear each other and see the nuance and say, yes, it is terrible what happened in Israel, and let's just grieve that really well. And it's also terrible what's happening over here. Why can we not see that with each other?
I think there's a lot of layers that could be peeled away in that question, but I'd suggest 2 of the big ones. One is proximity to the pain. to those who have been impacted. And the other, I think, is the centrality of Jesus. So let me start with that one. When we're talking about red letter Christians, is that we want a Christianity that looks like Jesus again. Gandhi, when he was asked about Christianity, he said, "I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him." So I think that's a lot of people's experience, is that they admire Jesus. They just aren't crazy about Christians. They haven't had a great experience with Christians. They see the contradictions, hypocrisy of Christians. And so when we talk about red letter Christians, I like to think that Jesus is the lens through which we understand Scripture. I mean, literally, Jesus himself said, you look through Scripture, looking for life, but you refuse to come to me for life. As Scripture says that Jesus is a full revelation of God. So the Word becomes flesh in Jesus. But what we often do is we interpret Jesus in light of revelation when it comes to, Israel or something, right? Or we twist a verse in the Hebrew Scripture to justify the slavery or violence. So you can find all kinds of things in Scripture if you're looking for them. But that's why Jesus becomes, to use a fancy seminary word, our hermeneutic, the lens through which we're interpreting the Bible and through which we're understanding how to live in the world. When Jesus is not central to everything, we can end up talking a lot about things Jesus didn't talk about. And we don't talk about the things that Jesus talked a whole lot about. And Jesus had a whole lot to say about the poor, the widows and the orphans, those he called the least of these, the most vulnerable people in society. So I think that has to become a central focus for us, right? I also think that Jesus was the Prince of Peace. It becomes impossible for me to reconcile violence with Jesus and the cross. I think you can't love your enemies and simultaneously prepare to kill them. So it becomes really hard to reconcile. So the centrality of Jesus, it's not that the other parts of the Bible don't matter. I just think that Jesus helps us understand and interpret all that. It's kind of like you guys are wearing glasses. I got my glasses. You can see forms. I can see blurry stuff. But when I put my glasses on, it gets a little bit more clear. And I think that's what Jesus does for Scripture for us and for God for us, help us to actually be able to see things. So there's a centrality of Jesus that is missing in a lot of Christian nationalism, Trump evangelicalism. I mean, you just don't hear a lot about love. You don't hear a lot about the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, there's even people that are saying that doesn't really work. Turning the other cheek, that's kind of weak. I mean, we've even heard politicians say, if Jesus had an AR-15 instead of a cross, the story might have ended differently for him. You're like, what the heck did, so I think that's. So the centrality of Jesus. The other thing I think is proximity.
Is that in the New Bible? I think it's in the New Bible that came out.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry.
Oh my goodness.
They actually took out the Sermon on the Mount and they put in the Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
So,
oh goodness.
Yeah, so,
okay, continue.
So the other thing that I think that proximity to the pain is clutch. And my friend Alexia Salvatierra has said so beautifully that a lot of times our problem is not a compassion problem. It's a proximity problem. It's a geography problem. The distance that we are from those who are impacted by injustice. And that's why privilege, one version of privilege is just being able to choose which issues you care about and which ones you don't, which ones you prioritize and which ones you don't. So we can't get everybody proximate to the children in Gaza, but I think part of what technology has done has made it really hard to ignore. We can't pretend that we didn't see it. We can try a lot of ways to hide from it, but that's what the Black Lives Matter movement did too, right? Is they put names and faces on police violence and injustice and racism, and now we know those names, but I think with so many issues like immigration, we can debate it, but when you have a name and a face of a family that has escaped Honduras and the stories that we know and that I know of friends of mine, it changes it. It changes when people are not just a statistic or a topic of debate, but they have names and faces. That matters. So I think that's part of it. Even with the death penalty, right? I've been visiting people on death row for over a decade, and that's part of why I have such an urgency. I know people that were wrongfully convicted. They were sentenced to die for crimes they had nothing to do with, right? I mean, you see how broken the system is when you're up close, right? But also, I know people that are guilty. My friend Don Johnson, he killed his wife brutally. And he did some really hard soul work to try to heal the wounds and courageous work to try to repair. And I saw what Jesus did in his life over the 10 years that I knew him before he was executed. And so a part of this is about the possibility of redemption, you know? And one of the most courageous things that the guys on Tennessee's death row have done is they invited Governor Bill Lee, the governor of Tennessee, to come pray with them and just listen to the stories of what Jesus has done in their life. And this wasn't a stunt. It was a genuine, sincere request. And every time there's an execution in Tennessee, we walk from death row to Governor Lee's office and we ask him to come pray with the men on death row before he carries out another execution. So that proximity makes all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that seems like a subversive friendship. I mean, it's the community that of people saying, I know this person. I mean, it's wherever people land on the LGBTQ plus community. I would say most of those people don't really know a person in that community. And so we just like chuck it out there and, you know, again, wherever anybody lands on that, it's okay to still love humans. You had mentioned something about compassion over our ideologies.
Yeah, I think we have a quote from Rethinking Life that talks about the proximity making a difference and that relationships move us from ideology to compassion. I'd love to hear also kind of your thoughts of what kind of opportunities are we missing in our relationships? Or is there a way we can rethink the power of relationships with people? Because I think we all make friendships or are in community for such different reasons. And some of it reflects our privilege and some of it reflects our need. And so it'd be awesome to kind of hear, like, if you are in a friendship with someone, this is where Jesus could really show up that you might be overlooking or missing out because of wanting to protect your comfort or whatever it might be.
I think of the encounters that Jesus lays out in Matthew 25. Which incidentally is a very important passage because it's Jesus saying this is the final judgment, right? Where all of us are going to be gathered before God and we're going to be asked a few questions. And interestingly enough, they're not just doctrinal questions, virgin birth, agree or disagree, you know, but these are questions when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was in prison, did you come visit me? When I was a stranger, did you welcome me, right? These are all like actually deeply personal, compassionate encounters. And I think that that's no coincidence, right? That this is about real relationships. It's not distant acts of charity that we write a check to some NGO and they do the work, you know? And fundamentally, I think Christianity, and I would even say just being a compassionate human being is about having those kind of relationships with those who are hurting, those who are vulnerable, and actually visiting people in prison and being with people who are hungry. And I think that's where you realize that our ideologies, things are more complicated than that. When people have those encounters, it changes us. I don't know a lot of people that change their mind because they lost an argument.
Right.
But I know a lot of people that their mind changed because their heart changed first. And their mind, like their theological constructs, even their political convictions began to shift because their relationships changed, right? And it began with compassion and relationship. And then that began to change some of the other things. So there's just so many stories of that. But one really courageous one was a friend of mine. I can actually say his name now because he's basically been fired. But his name's Adam Luck. And he was the head of the Board of Pardons and Parole in Oklahoma, which incidentally, Oklahoma now has lined up 25 executions. So it's the state with the most executions back to back being lined up. And Adam was appointed by Governor Stitt, the governor of Oklahoma, who is also a church-going Christian, that's carrying out these executions. And Adam was appointed by him. And he said, I started to look at these and I started to like understand the stories and see the question of innocence too. Like that some of these people were wrongfully convicted. Some of them like had terrible lives. I mean, one of the guys that was executed in Oklahoma, he was so abused. He had family members that put alcohol in his baby bottle. And they also introduced him to drugs and abuse. And he ended up taking someone's life, and yet like then he was executed, right? And you're like, this is messed up. So Adam became a person of conscience and all of that. And he said, I've always got to leave room for mercy and leave room for transformation. And so the same governor that appointed him asked him to step down from that position. But he's such a credible voice, right? And it wasn't any political thing. It wasn't even a really great panel on the death penalty, but it was that proximity. It was seeing all of this firsthand and also feeling the burden of responsibility that it's not just a system that's killing people. It's not just our government, but it's actually people with names like Adam Luck that for whatever reason are given the burden of responsibility of whether or not to green light an execution. And he just said, I can't do it. And that's amazing. So there's human stories in all of these. And I think that's what's so important. And we kind of forget sometimes in all of our debates and in all of our sort of layers of insulation, you know, that we have like, well, this is just a system that kills, or it's the criminal justice system, you know, or it's Israel killing the folks in Gaza. And then you like, there's 3 young people now that refuse to carry out orders for the Israeli Defense Force. And we're going to be having a panel on that next month. But these are unbelievably courageous young people, 19 years old, 20 years old, that went to jail rather than the mandatory military service to carry out the violence in Gaza. And so those human beings, like those names, those people, like they invite other people to have moral courage when we see that happen, right? And to say, no, you know what? I don't have to be a part of the apparatus that's destroying people's lives. I'm not going to do it. You know, I'd rather go to jail than do it. I'd rather get fired than do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Your quote was, relationships move us from ideology to compassion. We can't love our neighbor if we don't know them. And once we are proximate, love requires us to take action, to stand up for the life in tangible ways. What does this look like? So you're living there. I mean, you're like, I'm all in. Jesus said to do this. Let's go. Giddy up. This is where I'm going to live. Philly left all day long. What does this look like for the rest of us that don't live there, but I live in Franklin, Tennessee? And I have a good friend in Orange County where I grew up that's always saying, I don't know if I can live the way of Jesus. It's so hard having money and living where I live. I mean, it's just, what does this look like for us to actually live out the way of Jesus in the Western side of the world?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is I don't think that there's an anecdote, that there's not one prescription for what that has to look like. I do think that there are different pieces of the gospel that we've got to wrestle with, right? Sell your possessions and give them to the poor. How does that change the way I think about materialism and money and things, right? Don't stockpile things for tomorrow. Don't build bigger barns for your surplus while people don't have enough for today. You know, like these are really radical ideas when it comes to economics. I don't know exactly what it means for a 401k, but I have a hunch. What does it look like to love my enemy and to not repay evil with evil? I think there's some really good examples of that we can look to, like Dr. Martin Luther King, with how they wore evil down with love and how they refused to allow someone to make them hate. That's amazing. So I think one of the things is that beautiful passage in Romans says that we're not to conform to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So we're meant to be sort of holy nonconformists. But nonconformity doesn't mean uniformity. It doesn't mean we're all going to do the same thing. So I've met so many folks that are doing beautiful work inside the prisons. One of my friends writes every single person that's being executed this year. Another friend of mine, they have a bunch of kids. And they said, for every biological kid that we send to college, we're creating a scholarship for a kid that can't afford to go to college. That's just kind of what it looks like to love our neighbor as ourself. to go beyond biological family. For some folks, it's fostering kids or adopting kids. So there's like just so many ways. My friends now have a young woman from Gaza who's living with them. I think there's all kinds of ways that love can express itself. And the other thing I would say is that Frederick Buechner, who's a wonderful writer, said, we've got to take this is my paraphrase, but he said, we got to take our deepest passion and connect it to the world's deepest pain. And when our passions, the things that we love and are skilled in, connect with the world's pain and suffering, then that's where the magic happens. Then we do things that we're really wired to do, and it gives life to other people.
I love that so much. What would it look like for you to take your deepest passions and connect it to the world's deepest pain? I mean, what would it look like for me as a dad, a songwriter, a podcast host to redirect these passions and connect them to the pain of all the things that are happening around me? Like, what would that possibly look like? Communities far from me, communities close to me. Take a second. What could that potentially look like for you? I love that Shane is helping us see advocacy and seeing others as something we're already good at. We're already wired and blessed to make people whole, blessing, in a certain unique way. It's all about redirecting its purpose. So what could that look like? You might be amazing in the kitchen. What would it look like for you to feed the homeless community near you? Or I have a friend named Sarah who has been going to the grocery store, which she's good apparently at going to the grocery store. And she bought food for this family whose dad just found out he had cancer. And this dad and family have started hanging out in our church community just because hasn't said like, hey, you need to become a Christian. She's just awesome. And she's just using her gifts of just going to the grocery store and going, gosh, how could I serve these people? It's just so beautiful. Or if you're good at numbers, could you give your gift to kids who are struggling at school? My wife, Hillary, she's good at a lot of things, but one of the things she's doing is she found this organization that works with refugees from all over the world, and she's just helping them learn English. I love it. This is so beautiful. Okay, so let's start rethinking the ways we can use what we're good at, what we're passionate about, to serve those who are hungry, hurting, and alone.
I met some kids that are designing robots, and they found that kids in Afghanistan are being paid to dismantle landmines, and their lives are at risk. Their hands get blown off, and they saw all this and they're like, that's so messed up. So they're designing robots that can detect landmines and that can actually dismantle landmines. And also so kids in Afghanistan can play again, not worry about getting blown up. Like it's beautiful, holy work. Friends of mine that are using their gifts created a bottled water company because he found that the water that we buy, if we just drink tap water and didn't buy bottled water, it would fund water for the rest of the world, the money we spend in the U.S. on bottled water. So they started a bottled water company that all the money that generates from that goes to build wells. And then they had these engineers that are building like playground technology, merry-go-rounds and seesaws that pumps the water and cleans the water that the kids drink in that village. Just cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
Let's reimagine our vocations. Let's think about how our gifts can contribute to alleviating the suffering and the poverty of other people. And there's all kinds of ways we can do that.
I love that.
We just had a plumber tell us he's going to move in for a few months and just help everybody in the neighborhood that has a leaky faucet, or like we've got 3 abandoned houses that don't even have running water. Boom. That's awesome. So I think there's so many different ways people can use their gifts.
Yeah. I love that. And then I've got one more practical question for you. So as far as these subversive friends, these people that have different views from us, come from different places, the poor, the powerless, if you will. How do people reach out and have these relationships? So what you said in your quote was, we can't love our neighbor if we don't know them. And if those people in prison are our neighbors, if these people who are coming over here and have no homes, how do we actually get involved in those things? Or is it just, you just say, Jesus, open these doors? Or how do we do that? How do people that are listening to this podcast do that?
It's tricky because sometimes it's easier to love or to advocate for people on the other side of the world than on the other side of town. And so I think some of this is about almost exercising muscles that have atrophied a little bit, so you don't apparently just go run a marathon. That's a bad idea. In fact, I did a 10-mile run and I hadn't trained for it. So my knee was all boogered up. I read this thing about my knee. I was like, well, how bad is it? And they're like, runner's knee apparently is a thing. And they were like, it's when you run further than you've trained to run. And I was like, that's it.
Yep. Nailed it.
So, I see a lot of folks that have this idea of communal living, that they just jump right into. And I think we've got to actually begin to make space for community. And some of that is and make space for new friendships, right? I'm a white male. I got to get into some spaces where I'm outside of dominant white culture, where I'm in spaces where I'm not around homogenous circles of people just like me. And so some of that's joining stuff that other people are doing, supporting organizations that are already out there. There's a lot to be learned from the recovery community, folks in NA and AA, just circles of folks that are supporting each other. And then maybe it's, turning off some screens and some social media and some TVs and trying new things, I met this community. They said we live in a cul-de-sac, and they said God's saving some people from ghettos and other people from cul-de-sacs. And they said we've ended up being pretty individualized, lonely, don't know our neighbor kind of people. And they started doing a few things, grilling out once a month, and the whole neighborhood come together. Before long, they were running a summer camp for the whole cul-de-sac of kids, creating different spaces for community to happen. So some of it's old school, in fact, a lot of the world, indigenous cultures and others can teach us how to live more communally and how to do this a little better. When you look at the statistics, the richest places in the world often are the loneliest, most depressed places. And so this idea of kind of radical individualism is not a gospel value. I don't even think it's a human value. I think we're made to love and be loved. We're made for community. And we got all this other stuff that we try to hide behind. One of our groups that shares hundreds of thousands of dollars now started just as a bunch of people saying, we're going to tithe 10%. Obviously some of us grew up in church hearing that 10%, but we said, but all of that money that we put from our 10% of our salaries and incomes, we're going to share it with people that we know in our lives. So literally, when our corner store was robbed across the street at gunpoint, we were able to say, what money was lost in that? Because there's a bunch of us that believe in bearing each other's burdens. So we replaced that money. My neighbor's window was knocked out, and we were able to replace that. We paid for a funeral of a friend. We helped one of our elderly friends get dentures, all of that from this little fund of sharing that is relationally based. So our only limits are kind of our imagination, and so some of this is just about kind of trying new things and imagining new things and dusting off some old things, like the church tithe. That's what happened for us. Is we're like, yo, look at the early church, look at the Jubilee, look at Scripture. The tithe was not just to pay for these big church buildings and staff or something. It was a compassion fund. It was meant to be a way that we could literally meet needs of friends and carry each other's burdens when we have difficult times.
I guess I overthink it. We all probably are overthinking it. It's like, what's in front of you? How do we rethink these relationships? How do we either go pursue some of these relationships, or how do we rethink how we see these things? Rethink how I see my gifts, rethink what's going on with me, and how is this better for the whole of the community versus just what's best for me and my bottom line.
Yeah, my friend Tony Campolo, he has often said, God is not saying to the poor, come find the church, but God's saying to the church, go into the world, find me where I'm struggling.
Yes.
And so some of these relationships, it's not the burden of responsibility, it's the invitation. It's for us to get out of our buildings, to get to know our neighbors. The people in prison are not going to come find our church. We're going to have to find ways to get into the prisons. And not only does it change them, but it changes us. I mean, I've learned so much
Yeah.
about the gospel from visiting folks on death row. And now my mom's gone with me. My wife's gone with me to death row in Tennessee. I think sometimes it's most intimidating to have those experiences when you first do it. I mean, that's true with anything unfamiliar, right? You take kids from the city on a camping trip and you're kind of like, whoa. Like, I heard something. What was it? And you're like, that was a squirrel, and you take people from the country where I grew up and you come to the city. And I remember someone saying is that a gang on the corner over here? And I was like, no, those are Catholic schoolgirls. Like, that's a uniform that they wear.
Yeah.
So but the unfamiliar. And I started visiting folks on death row.
Yeah.
I've laughed till my side hurts, from the friendships there. I've cried with folks. One of the guys that I got to know before he was executed, I talked to him on the phone and I was like, I'm thinking he's got a really heavy heart, but it's actually almost the opposite. He's like, you know what? I've got a pure heart. Like everything I know to do, heal the stuff that I've done it. And I asked him, I said, would you like a prayer book? I'm thinking do you want some spiritual resources or something? And then
Right.
this is what he says to me, right? This is John Ramirez before he was executed. He goes, actually, I've been really wanting to learn to do origami. And he says, could you send me a book on origami? So I sent it to him, right? And one of the last things he did was he sent me a origami butterfly right before he was killed. And I thought, what a wild and wonderful act of almost defiance, they may try to kill me next week, but I think I really would like to learn origami before that happens, and it's just so moving. So I keep that origami butterfly in my Bibles, but so I mean, I think that's what we got to remember, right? That these are human beings. We're goofy, we're sinful, we're made in the image of God, every single one of us. Yeah. No one beyond redemption and no one above reproach. So that should keep us both humble and in awe of the image of God that's in every one of us.
So good,
Amazing.
Shane. Thank you so much.
So good to talk.
man.
Let's do it again sometime.
I just need to go cry for an hour. That was so comforting.
Was it comforting? You want to cry because it was comforting?
I think so. I think it affirmed something in me that I know I've been pushing for when it comes to my faith. Yes, I do believe this is the core of the gospel and of Jesus. I did ministry for so long. I felt so much pushback on it. I almost felt like, maybe I'm wrong. And then to have someone say that feeling in your gut to be moved, to want to get your hands on in your faith is real and it's happening. And yes, that should be the direction you should be going in. Yeah. So I think it was comforting, though it is hard to also listen to at times. Yeah. I thought, man, it almost feels like a big circle back to what Mike Foster said about us experiencing something in life and that being our superpower. And then seeing how Shane is encouraging us to use that in our relationships and move us into different proximities with certain people to bless people, make them whole with our superpower, just affirms something in me that I think I've just been restless about. How else can I go love? How else can I go join Jesus that we talk about all the time with people? And to see Shane almost give permission, in any way, these are the many ways I do, but in any way you can. You are all invited to that. I don't know. It comforted me.
Is there something specific that comes up to you that brings the emotion?
I think it's the fact that people are being seen. I think the restless part of me is that I think, man, there's so many people outside of this building that are not being seen. And, I think we've talked about this before I've been on this mission of trying to, when I connect with someone, let's say a homeless person, I'm learning their name because they haven't heard their name said in weeks. Statistically, that is proven in weeks. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to be joining Jesus and seeing people.
Yeah.
Whatever that may be, I might not be able to fix their problem. I might not be able to, whatever it is. But if we have experienced Jesus seeing us, I want other people to also experience that. And I want to be a part of that. And so I think him giving us back-to-back stories on how people responded with an expression of like, you're seeing me, moved me. And I said, yes, that's all I want my faith to be, a movement of all people being seen by Jesus and not washing my hands of it because of my ideology or my thoughts or my convictions or whatever it may be, and really prioritize people the way Jesus did. And so it just moved me. I was like, yes, I'm happy that this is actually happening because we're in such a tough place. And I think there are many people who have deconstructed, detangled, whatever is the most comfortable word for you, and have felt really like, but I'm still about the heart of Jesus. Is anyone out there who feel the same way, and to see it in action, I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it just moved me. What about you?
When you were younger, it's like, oh gosh, I think I'm going to have to go to Africa and move to Africa and abandon all the things that I want and become a missionary. I mean, he's basically that guy in Philadelphia. He's just like this missionary in this place, has forsaken all things, whatever. And it seems like this, gosh, I don't know if I can do that, which feels a little rich young ruler in my heart too.
Yeah.
A little bit like, will you give all that you have? And I understand. I've done messages on this of like, it doesn't mean that everybody has to give all their money. I get that. And I love that he gave so many examples of people that are like, man, I make freaking robots, so I'm going to make robots for little kids.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that. It just calls into question. I love the way of Jesus, but there are parts that I'm like, awesome, Jesus, that's so great. I'm probably not going to do that.
Right.
So that it makes me just rethink a little bit and have curiosity towards things that I'm about or holding on to. And then it also just is what's it look like for us to have these relationships with these people? Are they people that are already in our lives? Hillary, I think I've said it before, but Hillary has this compassion and just this heart for this community that's in Nashville of just a bunch of immigrants who barely speak English and want to learn English. And she's just has had this burden on her heart for past few years. And she just jumped in, is now teaching a class. It's like, Hillary, that's baller.
That's amazing.
That's like, she's just jumping in and doing it. She's taking her Thursday mornings and is going to go teach a class. And she's like, telling me stories every day. So she's jumping in.
Yeah.
And, she does not agree with all these people on all things. She has everybody from every religion possible.
Right.
It's not like she's like, good, we all agree on this one thing and we're all going to be saved. No, it's like she disagrees probably in major ways with these people. Yet she's just leaning in with compassion.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty simple thing. She's there on Thursday mornings. But I'm just going, gosh, what does that look like for our community? People that are listening to this, in our 10,000 minutes, what does it look like for us to reach out and not in a way of like, oh, you poor saps, I'm going to come in and save you, but just to be close to people, just to be in proximity with these people. So I don't know what that looks like. People, as you're listening, I don't know what this brings up in you. We would love to actually hear what this brings up in you.
Yeah. And if it like got under your skin, if it offended you in some way, I would get curious about that because we're on the same team. We're all trying to follow Jesus and love well and all the things. And so it's that point where like the rich
young ruler.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Or it's like, what is it that feels anti-you? And that might not be anti-Jesus. It's pro-Jesus, but it's anti-you. Like, get curious about that. What is it that feels like no, a hard no? And is the cost really that high to really be a part of what Jesus is already doing and what he's inviting us to? And I think also about the question that we like to encourage our listeners with is, what currently has your attention? Yeah. And could it include the people around you in that?
Yeah.
My current attention isn't baking all of a sudden. And who can I bake something for? We talk about that all the time.
Love
my
that
current attention is on my mom, and she just lost her mother. And so it's grief. And is there anybody else that I can have margin for right now that is also grieving, or that came up to mind because they were grieving last year? Like, create those moments that you feel present in and include the people around you in that.
Yeah. Yep. That is so practical. I mean, it's just rethinking where we are in life right now. What are the things that are happening in our world, in our specific story, and how could these be better for the whole?
Yeah.
Like, how could these be an actual blessing, making the world more whole?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wild. And we all have different things. Some of us have a ton of money. Some of us have zero money. So it's not that. It's like, what is...
And you might have time.
Yeah.
You might have connections.
Right.
You might have simple thing, a car. You never know. You might have something that you can easily extend to.
Yeah.
Like he talked about how love is not a limited resource.
Yeah.
What in your life do you feel like, oh, I feel very comfortable in this, and I don't feel like I am trying to survive in it, and I could probably extend it. And to me, it's been time. I've been trying to make sure that when I have it, I'm not hoarding it. I'm actually being present and volunteering, or being with a friend, or anything that's like creating community instead of like higher walls of my life, you know?
Right.
So I think that would be such a great challenge and encouragement for us. Like, where's your attention going, and how can that be shared?
Yeah. I just makes me think of my friend Hunter T. Just has a heart for his friends who are homeless. And Hunter's like, I don't know, man. I just found that we have a ton of blankets around the house. And so he would just go and give blankets out. He was out at like 2 a.m. one night. His dad told me, he's like, I don't know, man. He's out giving blankets because he's just found blankets.
Yeah.
I don't know how he's getting all these blankets, but he's like, that is something that he's actually making the world more beautiful, because he's just like, well, I don't know. We have a ton of blankets. Well, I can give those things away. Yeah. So beautiful. So people, would you let us know some of your thoughts? What kind of comes up to you? And maybe even bring this up to some of your friends and say, gosh, I have these resources. Let's get creative. Let's just dream a little bit.
Yeah.
So let us know how that goes. Thank you for listening to this. These are just so good for us. So if just selfishly we get to have these conversations and learn. So boy, you're amazing. And if you want to be part of our group in the in crowd, what we like to call the in crowd,
the club,
jump on our Facebook page. Or if you want to donate to what 10,000 Minutes is doing, if this has been really encouraging to you, go to 10,000minutes.com, 1000minutes.com. Anyways, all the stuff's in the show notes.
Yes.
We are supported purely by what you're giving. So you guys, thank you. And take this stuff to heart. Share this with some of your friends and say, let's figure this out. We don't agree with all the things that were said on here, but like, this is worth rethinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Moy.
Thanks, Tim.